What's up guys, it's Russ from Backyard Boat Works. So in this video I'm going to show you how I built this leaning post entirely out of 5/8 inch honeycomb panels and using 3/4 inch round PVC trim. So this is going to be a long video. I'm going to put the entire process in this video from start to finish. So if you want to jump ahead through some of these parts, you can. But I just want to preface this project by saying I built this leaning post probably now about 1.5 years ago. So some of the things that I did in this project, I probably would do a little bit differently now. However, it still worked really well, and I filmed it, so I'm not going to waste the footage. I'm going to show you guys how I built this leaning post, and I ended up selling it for about $800, which for the buyer was a great deal because I had a lot of time into it. But I ended up using this as a plug, and I pulled a mold from it so I could make more and more and more of them. So I just want to talk about what I'm doing here. So I set up a table with a 4x8 sheet of melamine plywood, and I set the Nitacore on top of it so that I can laminate this entire 4x8 sheet of Nitacore before starting my project. So I decided to do it this way because I felt it was going to be a lot easier to work with a full laminated sheet than it would be to cut the individual pieces out of the Nitacore and then laminate them individually. I'm 50-50 on this decision because cutting the pieces out of the Nitacore actually was a lot easier to do, as you'll see here as I move through the video, but it also created a lot of waste and a lot of wasted Nitacore, a lot of wasted glass, and a lot of wasted resin because I had some scrap pieces left over that obviously I ended up not using. So here you can see I laid out about maybe 24 ounces of resin on half of this Nitacore sheet, and then I rolled over the 1708 onto that half. And the reason why I'm only doing half is because it's very warm out when I was doing this. It was in the middle of the summer and the resin just kicks way too fast. So I'm mixing my resin probably less than 1%, but still you only have a very short window before it starts to gel. And once it starts to gel, it's game over. If you can't get the resin on this piece and get it wet out before it starts to gel, then you just wasted all that glass and all that resin. You're gonna have to peel it off and start from scratch. So I'm doing small batches here. I think that cup, those are about 16 ounce pours, maybe 24 ounce pours. And I'm doing it little by little, spreading out the resin, getting it saturated into the piece, and then only pouring out as much as I feel like I can safely wet out before it starts to gel. So since making this video, I started to use a wet out roller, which is kind of like a miniature bristled brush that works really well for moving the resin around and wetting it out and laminate like this. I think if I had one of those wet out brushes, you can see them, I use them in a lot of my videos recently. I think it would have made this process a lot easier and a lot faster. But at the time I wasn't aware that they were available and I didn't have it. I was using a squeegee to move the resin around and pull the excess resin out of the laminate. So at the time I picked up this extra large roller, which actually worked really well. You can see here that I'm just rolling out the pieces, rolling out the air bubbles in large sections. This worked really well. If you're going to do something like this, I would highly suggest it. All right, so after that cured on that side, I just flipped it over and trimmed up the edges here with my oscillating tool. This works really good on stuff like that because it keeps the dust down. When you're using a cutting wheel, dust flies all over the place. And here I used a flap disc just to clean up some of the drips that came around the bottom side of the Nitacore. And then I had to do that lamination all over again on the other side. All right, so here you can see the full sheet, 4x8 sheet of 5/8 inch Nitacore completely laminated. So I put some weight on the nitocore just to hold it down, because the heat, the exotherm from the resin will cause a nitocore to potato chip or warp or bend or whatever you want to call it. So you want to hold it down so that it doesn't, it doesn't warp while it's curing. All right, so I started this process by making a very basic wood mock-up template of the shape that I wanted to make. So I used this to measure it up to my boat, where I was going to place it in the boat, cut the pieces, and just kind of temporarily brad nailed and screwed it together to hold it temporarily in place. All right, so once I had the template made and the sheet completely laminated, I used the template to cut out the pieces that I was going to need to actually start assembling the leaning post. So here I'm just tracing the shape that I need on the nitocore, and this is the main reason why I laminated the sheet all in one piece, because when I go to cut out these shapes, I'm going to have, if I follow the lines exactly, I'm going to have exactly the shape that I need to put this together so that it matches up to my template perfectly. If I cut the nitocore out, the nitocore is kind of hard to cut because it's flimsy and it might not have been as precise. So here I used my oscillating cutting tool to cut out these pieces, and this works pretty good, but it's kind of slow and it's really tough on the blades. If you don't have a good quality blade, it's going to chew the teeth off it really quick. However, I've since started using a fiberglass cutting blade on my jigsaw, and that's what I would have used to cut these pieces out if I was doing it today. Still, the jigsaw works good, has good control, and those fiberglass cutting jigsaw blades last a really long time. So I just kind of wanted to do a little demonstration on how strong this 5/8 inch nitocore is. This is just one layer of 1708 on each side, and I put it on some 2x4s, and here I am standing on it with all my weight, and it has barely any deflection, about 175 pounds, and it's kind of amazing that that much glass can hold that much weight. All right, so after I cut the pieces out of the nitocore with the oscillating tool, I lined them up with the template again, and there was a little bit hanging over the edge, so I just used my flap disc here and then used the template as kind of like a guide to trim up the nitocore pieces perfectly to the template. All right, so here's the fun and interesting part of the project. So I had this crazy idea to use 3/4 inch quarter round PVC trim. This is just regular Home Depot trim that you can buy, Home Depot, Lowe's, any store. And I cut them at 45-degree angles on the edges and lined everything up so that it extends the edges of this nitocore and makes a perfect radius all the way around. And you'll see here, as we start to attach these to the nitocore, how it's all going to come together and make super clean edges to this part. All right, so here I'm using, it's a FGCI product. It's called a Super Bond epoxy adhesive, and you really need to use epoxy for this because the core in the nitocore here, as I'm pointing out, is plastic, and polyester products will not stick to plastic. They may stick, but not very well. Epoxy, on the other hand, will stick to plastic, and it sticks very well to the PVC. So we're using this epoxy here, and this is a 1-to-1 mix. So I just scoop out equal parts part A, equal parts part B, mix it together, and we're going to put it on the PVC to secure it to the edges of this nitocore. So after I mix up the epoxy, now I'm taking a rubber plastic squeegee and I'm just trying to push it into the voids in this honeycomb. And the reason I'm doing that is because I just don't want to have any air voids between the epoxy and the PVC piece. Any air voids obviously is going to weaken the bond. So I just fill these in, make sure that I fill up these holes with epoxy first. And then I'm going to come back and add a little bit more epoxy and put the PVC pieces of trim in place. So this epoxy has pretty good adhesion on its own, and you really don't need to hold it or clamp it into place. If it's super hot out, the epoxy can get a little thinned out from the heat and it might not hold as well, but this super bond epoxy is kind of like a suction, and it just, once you put it in place, it really just holds itself. But I did use some blue masking tape just to kind of temporarily hold it there so it didn't fall off while it was curing, and I could walk away from it and not have to worry about it. So just cleaning up some of the excess that's squished out from the gap. So we want to try to get as much of that off as possible, because we will be using polyester in the next step. So we don't want to have a bunch of epoxy interfering with our polyester on the next steps. All right, so here's the next day. I let it sit overnight. This epoxy is like a 10-minute epoxy, so it dried pretty quick. But now it's permanently attached to the edge of this Core, and this epoxy kind of blows my mind sometimes at how strong the adhesion is. So you'd have to hit this with a sledgehammer to get it off, and even then, I think you'd probably break it before it came off. All right, so here's a video of the entire piece with all the edges with the epoxy glued on. You can see here I just put everything, lined everything up, cut the angles on my miter saw that I needed, taped it, and held it in place temporarily, and I'll let the epoxy dry. All right, so here I'm just cutting notches in my template, and you're going to see here in a moment why I cut these notches out of the template. All right, so now I'm going to use this template to temporarily kind of mock up these panels into place using the template to support the pieces. Here I'm just using some Harbor Freight pressure thingies, whatever they're called, clamps, to hold it to the template. This is where the template came in really handy. So I'm just going around, put them in place, and getting ready to tack glue these pieces together. That's why I cut the notches in the template. All right, so you can see here now that I have the pieces temporarily held together, this is why I cut the notch. So I'm going to mix up some more of that Super Bond epoxy. I'm just going to run a bead of epoxy here between the front piece and the side piece, and that epoxy is just kind of going to act as like a tack weld, as if you're welding aluminum or steel or whatever, and the epoxy is just going to hold it together. And once we tack it together, then we start to glass the outside, and that's going to tie all of the pieces together. So you can see here where the PVC meets that front piece. It doesn't line up, obviously, but it's PVC and it sands super easily. And we're going to just take our sanding disc and grind that PVC down so that the radiuses all line up. I mixed up some of that epoxy again, and here I'm just using an oversized popsicle stick, or it's like a mini paint stirring stick, and I'm just using it to push it into this corner here and using the radius on the edge of that stick to smooth it out and clean up the epoxy. Alright, so now that most of it's tacked together here, I'm just taking my flap disc and I'm cleaning up those edges that didn't perfectly line up with the PVC. So here I'm just putting a little radius on it. I actually used the flap disc to take off the heavy pieces, and then I came back by hand to finish it because I didn't want to grind off too much PVC by mistake, and I can't easily put it back. I mean, I guess I could fill it with epoxy or something, but I ended up fine-tuning the edges by hand. Alright, so not all of my pieces lined up perfectly. I was kind of expecting it. We're not working with precise templates or things here, so you can see that the alignment's off a little bit. But I'm going to fix that with some filler and some glass and straighten it out here in just a moment. So I know I did some finishing work by hand, but I did use my DA sander here, and I turned the speed down quite a bit. And here I'm just cleaning up the radius corners and also scuffing the PVC, because now we're going to put chop strand mat over these edges, and I wanted it to have a nice tooth to bite to, so I'm just cleaning up any of the excess epoxy and getting it ready for the glass. Alright, so after that little bit of sanding, you see here we got a nice clean radius, and everything meets up pretty well in most of these sections, and the rest of it I'll have to clean it up with some filler. So here I'm just using a straight edge clamped onto the piece, and I'm using it to trim up the piece that's going to be the seat section of the leaning post. So now that it's all fully epoxied and tacked together, I can pull the template out, as we really don't need the template anymore. Alright, so I need to put the large back piece on, and I had some troubles getting this piece to line up. So what I did here is I cut some 1x4 to the height that I needed the back piece to sit, and I cut 4 pieces here and just temporarily clamped them in place, because you can see here on the end I have a big gap, so I need to pull these side pieces in to meet the edges of the back piece. And my plan here is to use a ratchet strap or 2 ratchet straps, wrap it all the way around, and ratchet strap pull it together so that I can take up that gap and then finish epoxying it together. So the ratchet strap worked really well, and once I had it all in place, lined up, I mixed up some Super Bond epoxy again, and I'm just tack welding it together, the side pieces to the large back piece. Alright, so this is the last piece to go in, and it's the seat section. So I decided to put these little ledges here. You can see I glued these these strips along the edge, and that's going to allow the seat piece to sit on top of these ledges. Otherwise it would just kind of fall through to the bottom. This is going to give it added strength for obviously when somebody's sitting on it, and also it's going to hold it temporarily while I epoxy it and glass it in place. Alright, so you can see here it's completely tacked together. Use some extra epoxy to fill in some little gaps here. You can see here that it didn't completely line up, probably because I cut it a little short, but I got these extra long clamps holding it while the epoxy dries. All right, so after everything was cured, I took my DA sander again with 60 grit, and I just went around and started to just clean up everything a little bit more. And you can see the epoxy filled in all the gaps, all the radiuses that I sanded down are looking pretty good. Just now going to move on to the glass and then the final finishing. All right, so something that popped up here is that this little piece along the seat, you can see it's warped. I put a straight edge here. You can see that there's a gap, so it kind of warps inward. So I'm going to have to fix that here real quick using some core mat, which is a bulker material, to kind of quickly fill in that gap. So I cut some strips of this core mat. I'm not sure exactly what thickness core mat this is, so I'm just going to saturate it with resin and then lay it down in the areas where I need to fill that gap. And then we're going to come through with filler and glass over the top of this core mat. This is, like I said, a core mat bulker, and it fills voids and gaps and builds a laminate really, really quick. I've never shown the use of core mat in any of my videos before, so I figured I would show you this little section here. So I just laid the core mat on top of the thing. I'm going to be doing glass here, so getting resin on the top of this isn't a big deal for me at this point. So core mat is more or less, it's a silica in a sheet form. So if you ever use silica to thicken resin to make a putty, it's basically silica in sheet form. So you just saturate it out and stick it on there like you would any piece of glass. And it kind of holds its shape after it's wet out, and you can pick it up, move it around. And here I'm just using the chip brush to make sure that it's fully wet out and adhered well to the base laminate. So the cool part with the core mat is it holds a lot of resin and it sands really easily. So just make sure that I put enough in the areas where I need to fill, and then I come back with the sandpaper and taper it out as I need it. All right, so the next step here is to use 1.5 ounce chop strand mat, and I'm using polyester resin here just to cover the edges of all this PVC, and this is just going to tie the front, the back, the sides, and everything together. So this entire thing will get a full coat of 1.5 ounce chop strand mat, and the chop strand mat kind of acts as fairing compound as well, and it will help me to get this smooth and ready for primer and paint. So you might be asking yourself, didn't he use epoxy to put those on, and isn't polyester going to interfere with epoxy? And the answer is yes. However, that epoxy has cured for several days, and as long as it's 100% cure and you sand it with probably 60 grit, the polyester will stick just fine. All right, so after that core mat cured, I'm using my flap disc here just to gently taper it to fill in that gap issue that I was having. All right, so after I was done filling the gap and fine-tuning that core mat to where I wanted it, I used some thickened resin here as a radius putty, and then I came back and put chop strand mat over the top of it to make a nice transition from the top to the bottom. So that's going to be a wrap on this video, guys. You can see all the steps that I used to make this leaning post. So you can duplicate this process to make a center console, a fish box, pretty much anything that you can think of. The materials, the concepts, and it's all the same. Just make your wood template of the shape that you want to make, and use that template to cut your pieces and hold everything together, glue it together, and then primer, fair, sand, 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 and more sand. I swear to God, boat building is just sanding, and waiting for stuff to dry. So if you have any questions, leave a comment down below. I appreciate you guys watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do hit the like button. The like button and your comments help this video reach more people. So please hit the like button. Hit the like button. And appreciate it, guys. See you in the next one. Talk to you soon.